Thanks, Anthony. There's some great stories, but also some really disturbing ones. Go to lawandcrime.com. We cover all of the major legal news and legal crime stories, and just well as legal news, where you can follow it there. So go to lawandcrime.com. But I want to talk a little bit more about that TSA story and see what's really happening. So let me bring on my very special guest for the morning, Law and Crime trial analyst, Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, great to see you.
Jesse, good morning.
So we looked at that video. Was anything illegal there? Does this woman, her family, have a cause of action?
Listen, I watched the video. I know it went viral. People are outraged, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. I can't figure out why there is such outrage, and here's why. The pat-down itself may have been a little lengthy, but no, this TSA agent didn't abuse, didn't assault, didn't do anything wrong. I think the reason why the search took a little longer than usual is because you had a frail woman in a wheelchair, as opposed to maybe you or I, who just, would go into the secondary pat-down area and be patted down while we were on our own 2 feet. But listen, we live in a world now where terrorists can be getting a lot smarter, and it's not beyond the realm that they would start using elderly people in wheelchairs to do their bidding. I think this was a good job by TSA. Nobody got injured, and I'm not sure what all the outrage is about.
But why her? Why did they pat her so much? I know that I think the whole family was in wheelchairs, and I've seen before. How do you think they select? They said, let's check her a lot. And I mean, they're checking her in some pretty intimate areas.
Well, have you ever been in a secondary pat-down when you were traveling? I have.
Yeah.
It's very intimate. But them's the rules, as they say now. And I don't know how they select their candidates. I know that, they'll put a certain check mark on your ticket as you're approaching security, and you're the one who's going to get pulled over, so to speak. So I don't know that, but I don't think there's anything wrong with their selection procedure either.
By posting this virally, and I know that her family complained to Dulles Airport. Dulles had to respond. And, well, let's say there is some sort of legal action taken. Are you afraid that this would chill TSA inspectors from doing their duties and doing thorough searches?
Certainly, if there were a lawsuit that resulted adversely to the TSA, yeah, I think that could have an effect on all of us, right? Because we want to be smarter and safer, not the opposite, just because a family is disgruntled over a 96-year-old woman who gets patted down. Fortunately, there probably aren't a whole lot of women in her age group that travel. My grandmother's 92. She's never seen the inside of a plane. But we have to be safer, and we do need to worry about wheelchairs. Look, little baby carriers get searched, right? Your laptop case gets searched. It's all for a reason. We may not like it, but we have to live with it in this day and age.
And it's not Dulles who's actually responsible for this, the airport. It's really TSA. Am I correct in thinking about that?
Right. TSA, right. Employed by the federal government, and they have their rules and regulations, and it has to be fluid depending on the times. And look, and if this TSA agent had in any way hurt this 96-year-old woman, then I would certainly understand the outrage. She did not. She was very careful in her duties.
And explained to her what's happening. Now, we don't know what's going on in this woman's mind, this 96-year-old woman's mind, but she seems to be receptive to all of the requests, doesn't seem to be putting up a fight as much as her daughter was. Now, here's the problem with this kind of case as compared to some sort of shop or even the Starbucks situation. You can't boycott the TSA. You need them. You can't boycott airplanes. How are you going to get from A to B? So doesn't that put everybody in a really difficult position to try to make change there, even though there's an argument whether or not it even needs to be made a change?
That was going to be my point. Do we have to make any change? I mean, people, unless we start patting down everyone, which we'll never be able to get in the air because it'll take too long.
Right.
I mean, this is the system that's in place. It seems to be working, knock on wood, right? Because I think the incidents of plane terrorism have diminished, if not been eliminated. So if it ain't broke, why fix it? I don't see this as a situation that needs fixing.
And at the end of the day, everybody's okay. And we always want to be safe rather than sorry.
Right.
But we'll have to see what happens. We'll update you about anything that happens with regard to this issue. All right, we're going to switch gears right now. We're going back to North Carolina. We're going back to the Wallace Bradsher case. This really, really bizarre case of two elected officials who are alleged to have entered into a criminal scheme to steal taxpayer money by employing their wives, paying them, and they really didn't have much work to do. Well, I shouldn't say that. Mr. Bradsher, his wife, Pam Bradsher, that worked at Craig Blitzer's office, she seems to have been doing work, but the problem is for Cindy Blitzer, who is Craig Blitzer's wife that worked at Wallace Bradsher's office, She said she was doing work for a period of time. She testified earlier in this case. But then all of a sudden, the main case she was working on, the Shockley case, was taken away from her by the defendant, and she had nothing to do but was still encouraged to clock in her hours, collect her paycheck, and cash those paychecks. That is stealing taxpayer money, and she basically said, I knew it was wrong, but we needed the money. What we're going to do right now is we wait for the live feed in the courtroom, and I'm keeping a careful eye on it right now. I want to play you some of the testimony of Cindy Blitzer. She is the main focal point in this entire case. So let's play you some of her testimony, and we can understand how this whole sword affair took place.
All right.
That's Cindy Blitzer, the main subject in the Wallace Bradsher case, because Bradsher is accused of operating an illegal scheme with her husband to employ her, pay her, collect checks, but really for work that she didn't do. Let's bring back on Jonna Spilbor. So as we sit here today and we wait for the live feed and we listen to Miss Blitzer testifying and said that her work was taken away from her by the defendant. Yeah. She repeatedly tried to call him to get more work, saying she didn't have work. Do you believe her?
You know, it's a bit of a stretch. Like, her story doesn't make sense from a common sense perspective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because let's look at the scheme, right? The scheme is, I'm going to hire your wife, you're going to hire my wife, but they're not going to have anything to do. We're just going to let them collect $1,000 a week for life as if they won the lottery. So for her to take the stand and say, well, it wasn't me, like, I wanted to work, but Mr. Bradsher wasn't giving me any work, why wouldn't he? Like, so in other words, I don't believe that she was asked, the part I don't believe is that she was asking for work.
This is the part that confuses me too. By all accounts, his wife, Bradsher's wife, who was employed by Craig Blitzer, she actually had work to do. She was getting paid. I don't think there was a big issue there. So really the issue is with Cindy Blitzer. Today, her and her husband are testifying against Bradsher.
Right.
What would he have to gain by keeping her employed and continuing to pay her? And they've made statements in their testimony where they've said, we thought it was really odd. We told him that maybe Cindy should resign, and he kept pushing her and pushing her to stay on. What's the incentive for him? It's not his wife getting the money. He's not getting any money. Right. That's the part that I'm confused about.
Well, if this were a quid pro quo kind of agreement, then the incentive for Bradsher to keep Blitzer employed is that then Bradsher's wife wouldn't get fired from her job with Blitzer. And we also have to keep in mind, like, this really truly is a case of, like, who's on first, and you got to pay attention to it. I mean, so if you think about it, the Blitzers, who are co-conspirators with Bradsher, took a deal. And that's why they're testifying against him. So usually when that happens, when you take a deal, when you're a cohort, you have to provide information that's going to be helpful in gaining a conviction, or you're useless. What's the point? We could prosecute you too. So for those two reasons, there very well could be a credibility issue with the Blitzer testimony here.
And that's what Wallace Bradsher, the defendant who's representing himself, has continually tried to do in this case when he's had the ability to cross-examine these witnesses, including Craig Blitzer, his co-conspirator, as well as Cindy Blitzer. Keeps saying you have to attack their credibility and pointing the finger at them, saying that I had nothing to do with her clocking in her hours and her collecting paychecks. I didn't sign off on that. That's really what Wallace Bradsher wants to get out. Let's play you some more of Cindy Blitzer's testimony, and this is when she talks about how her husband was the main conduit to have a conversation with the defendant, because according to her, she kept trying to reach Wallace Bradsher to tell him she didn't have work and that something was wrong, but he kept ignoring her phone calls and her messages. So she said the only person that he would really respond to is my husband. Let's learn a little bit more about that right now. That's a continuation of Cindy Blitzer's testimony, key witness testimony in the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina. This bizarre case of elected officials, DAs, operating an illegal scheme to steal taxpayer money by hiring each other's wives for no-show jobs. And Cindy Blitzer is the wife of Craig Blitzer, and she's saying, look, I was getting paid and I was having no work to do. And she said at one point, I knew it was the wrong thing to do. But why was she asked that? Okay, let's ask Jonna Spilbor. Why was she asked by the prosecution? What was your opinion of what was happening? Did you think it was the right thing to do? Why is that important?
All right, so look, we've got people sitting in the jury box who are listening to a woman testify who, for all intents and purposes, defrauded the county. I mean, she was taking a paycheck and she wasn't working. And so she is essentially a criminal too. So in order for the jury not to dislike her or to, in fact, give her credibility, you have to humanize this woman. And the only way really to do it is say, look, I knew it was wrong, but I needed the money. That's something that's relatable to the jury in this case. I really think so. And that's really the only thing she can say. Like, you want to know that. Why did she keep showing up for work? Although, let me say one other thing, Jesse. Like, I don't know if she's going to try to pretend that, listen, I was showing up for work just because there wasn't any work to do doesn't really make me an accomplice, does it? I mean,
according to her, she kept trying to contact the defendant saying she had no work to do, and in fact she tried to resign on multiple occasions and he wouldn't have any of it, pointing the finger at Bradsher.
How do you not get a hold of your boss? I have 10 people that work for me. They can get me 24/7, right? They get me on Christmas. How do you not be able to communicate with your boss?
Or just go in and knock on the door.
That doesn't make any sense.
Although, there was an issue about which office she was actually working in, but she could have driven over, right? Even if she wasn't in an office.
You communicate with your employees. It defies logic to think that a boss wouldn't communicate with an employee unless they were up to no good.
You don't have a personal shield when people need to get a hold of you?
I wish I did.
No one speaks to Jonna directly. No one talks to Jonna directly.
Right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot more to discuss in this case. And again, we are keeping a very careful eye on the courtroom because as soon as we have a live feed, we'll make sure to go to it. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, Cindy Blitzer providing some crucial testimony in this case. It'll be up to the jury to believe her, maybe not believe her. It's a difficult job for the jury because they're having to sit there and wonder what happened here. This man, Wallace Bradsher, the defendant, is on trial for operating this illegal scheme with her husband to hire her, pay her, and she really had no work to do. Do we believe her? Do we believe her husband? Do we believe the both of them? Do we believe Bradsher? It's tough to say. But that was an interesting conversation about her employment being terminated, and she's not the only one who was terminated in this case. Let's bring back in Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. I want to talk about termination right now. Do you think it's odd that she was ultimately terminated by Bradsher after she said she wanted to resign? Let's start there.
No, not at all. Because at that point in time, basically the cat was out of the bag. SBI was breathing down people's necks. Like, this scheme had sort of come to the fore, and I think the only way that Bradsher could try to insulate himself was to be like, oh, now I must fire you. You can't quit, you're fired. And that's exactly what he did. And it was completely self-serving, in my opinion.
There's another woman in this case, Deborah Hallbrook. She's alleged to have been the whistleblower in this case who blew the lid off of this entire scheme. She worked at Wallace Bradsher's office, and she was fired. She filed a civil lawsuit against multiple parties, including the defendant himself, saying that she was fired as a form of retaliation. He came back and filed a lawsuit against her, saying that I didn't fire you because of that. I fired you because you were a bad employee. What do you think of all that, Jonna?
Well, you are protected. So-called whistleblowers are protected against having their position terminated because we want to encourage that behavior, not discourage it. And frankly, so she probably has a sound lawsuit there. You can't then turn around and sue somebody because they were a bad employee. You can fire somebody because they're a bad employee if it has nothing to do with retaliation. But you can't sue them for being a bad employee, you know what I mean? So I think he was just trying to, his best defense is a good offense, in his opinion, with his retaliatory lawsuit.
Well, we'll have to see what happens, this whole mix of problems for Wallace Bradsher, who does face potentially 18 years in prison. It's sad to think about this for one perspective. He's married, has many children. This is not a murder case, this is not a sexual assault case, and not a kidnapping case, but there are lives at stake, and there's a lot at stake here. And this is about corruption, greed, public trust that was betrayed. And if the question is, will this man be found guilty and sentenced to his crimes if the jury believes that's what ultimately happened? Maybe they'll find him innocent. Maybe they'll believe that he really had no idea what was going on, and that really it's the Blitzers who took advantage of this situation. Well, the only thing better than Cindy Blitzer's direct examination is her cross-examination, because Mr. Bradsher, the defendant himself, who's representing himself, had the opportunity to directly cross-examine his accuser. Let's take a look.
Reading that.
I love a good cross-examination there, and that's an important cross-examination from Wallace Bradsher, cross-examining his accuser, Cindy Blitzer. Was it effective? That's the beginning part of it, and why was he asking those particular questions? Let's talk more about it with Jonna. Jonna, why start off by saying she reads her letter of recommendation that he gave to her after he fired her?
Right.
Why ask her, he says, were you deserving of that letter of recommendation? Why start there?
Well, I think what Bradsher is trying to do is paint himself as the victim of this scheme. He's trying to make the jury...
Maybe he is.
And maybe he is. He's trying to make the jury believe that, look, I didn't know she didn't have any work. I just had signed the paychecks or whatever I was responsible for, but I didn't know any of that. I thought she was a great employee, which is why I gave her a glowing letter of recommendation when I had to can her. And if I had known she wasn't working, do you think she would have deserved that letter? That's the insinuation here. The other thing that is really striking me listening to him cross-examine her, normally I would say you should never represent yourself, even if you are an attorney. But this defendant is getting to testify by cross-examining this witness. And I think it's going to serve him. I mean, listen to him. He was the one. He was the boss. He's at the center of this, and he gets to talk intimately, one-on-one with a former employee. Do you think you deserve that letter? Like, I think it's going to actually help him, and I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth right now.
How awkward is this for the two of them? She worked for him. He's the defendant. She's testifying against him. This is extremely awkward, in my opinion, no?
It usually is awkward when you have, like, quote-unquote, a victim who is being directly or cross-examined by a defendant when there's been some sort of, like, physical altercation. Like when you have people who aren't attorneys who crazily represent themselves and, you have somebody on the stand who says, it was you who shot me. You're the one who shot me. Very, very awkward. This is a little bit different because this was an employee-employer relationship where really only Bradsher could have those sort of minute details about the day-to-day. And he's the one that's coming out of his mouth in front of the jury that's going to be judging this case. This is actually very fascinating.
But she seems to be a believable witness. Again, she's the employee. She has a husband who's an attorney, a district attorney. Her boss is a well-renowned district attorney. I'm looking at her, and if I'm sitting in the jury wondering, why not just, if they're telling me it's okay, even though she kind of knew it was wrong,
right?
Does that really absolve Mr. Bradsher? I'm not sure.
No, I'm not so sure either, but you got to remember, these juries have to look at her, from both corners of their eyes because she actually did something wrong. She took paychecks knowing that she didn't earn them and put them in the bank because, according to her, they needed the money. That is wrong. And yet, the jury has to say, okay, she did something wrong then, but let me believe her 100% now. Some jurors may have a problem with that.
Well, let's see. We're going to continue our live coverage today, and we will see what happens. We will see what the defendant ultimately does. The question is, will he take the stand himself? We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's play you some more of Cindy Blitzer's cross-examination. And again, a very unique situation when you have the defendant who's representing himself having the ability to cross-examine his accuser directly. Let's take a look. Okay, that's Cindy Blitzer testifying against Wallace Bradsher, the defendant, in this bizarre criminal scheme where two district attorneys hired each other's wives, but Mr. Bradsher is accused of hiring Cindy Blitzer, paying her, and she was really not doing any work. And that's basically stealing taxpayer money. Back here with Jonna Spilbor, here's the question. You brought up a really good point before. You said, as this man, Wallace Bradsher, who's defending himself, has the opportunity to cross-examine these witnesses, it gives him the ability to tell his story, to explain what happened in that way. But that's not the only thing he can do. He can literally take the stand himself, can't he? And what would happen if he did that?
So he could take the stand himself, and basically it would be a soliloquy because he is acting as his own attorney. So he's not going to go on the stand and say, ask himself a question and then answer it. He's basically going to simply testify, and of course the prosecutor in this case could interpose objections. But I I don't want to miss the salient points here. He just made another, I think, pretty good point in his own defense, and that is, you know, the one time that he happened upon Cindy Blitzer to pick up a file, he observed her working on it. So her testimony is, I wasn't working and I was getting a paycheck, and now he's, again, through his questions, basically getting to tell the jury, well, I found her at work, dressed in work clothing, with a file in front of her, working on it. So I was none the wiser. Great for him.
Basically, because if he's the one in charge of the whole office, he's not going to be monitoring everybody. Are you working, you're working, you're working.
Right.
But the times that he did see her, she appeared to be working.
Exactly.
However, she's saying, I contacted you multiple times, and even my husband contacted you and told you I had nothing to do. After you took the Shockley file away from me, I had no work to do. Now, isn't it a she said, he said situation? So how's the jury supposed to believe one party over the other?
It is, and that's going to be ultimately for the jury to decide. And I think it's also interesting that she kind of stumbled a little bit in that she said to him, she was sort of communicating through her own husband, who was a district attorney in a neighboring community, and that she really didn't communicate directly with Bradsher himself. That might actually work to his favor, too, because if you think about, look at any DA's office, right? Look at the DA's office here in Manhattan. You got the DA, and then you have a whole lot of people working underneath him, and the top dog doesn't necessarily know what a middle dog is doing because there are different layers of management. And he, I think, is trying to tell the jury, look, I didn't have to be hands-on, but when I was, I saw her working.
This testimony is really fascinating to listen to and watch, particularly in this case, because you have really his main accuser on the stand, and he has the ability to cross-examine her. What we're going to play for you now as we wait for the live feed in that courtroom is we're going to play you some more of her testimony. This is when she gets into, again, working, going to nursing school, collecting those paychecks, but this is the part also when she talks about, because it's alleged that she had people in her husband's office taking online classes for her. The story of this gets more weird as we talk about it, stranger and stranger. Let's play you some of that testimony right now. This is when the testimony gets really good, and she starts talking about how she allegedly had people or employees from her husband's office take online classes for her, although she disputed that. She said that they just assisted her. We'll talk about that a little bit. I want to bring back in Jonna Spilbor. So this case gets really bizarre, more bizarre as we keep hearing details of it. She's alleged to have asked employees from her husband's office, and I don't even know if that's the right word, asked, because they work for her husband.
Right.
So how would she, if you're working for her husband, are they really going to say no to helping out here?
Right.
The allegations that she had them take online nursing school classes for her, she said, no, they just helped assist me. What do you make of this if you're sitting in the jury?
This, you know what, here's what I make. I love the fact that we get to cover this stuff live, because I got to tell you, when we do our research on these cases, you can kind of formulate an opinion. I've been doing this long enough to do that. And listening to this particular witness, I am changing my mind. And if I'm changing my mind, you can bet the people in the jury box are probably going through the same thing.
How are you changing your mind?
Well, because here's the thing. I figured, look, they have this guy, Bradsher, dead to rights. He's got a co-defendant who is also a DA who pled guilty to being a part of this scheme. You got him and his wife testifying against the defendant. You got the defendant, which originally I thought making the mistake of representing himself, but now I'm actually thinking it's working for him because he gets to testify through his cross-examination. And I look at this woman on the stand and I say to myself, she's soft-spoken and she comes across as just this nice person. But she was the one who was really the head honcho here, showing up, not having anything to do, getting her husband's employees to do her bidding for her online nursing course, and collecting a paycheck week after week, never speaking to the defendant, really only communicating through her husband to the defendant. So how can you really lay the blame on the defendant who's representing himself in this case? My mind is changing.
You talked about him representing himself. It might have been a bad idea at the beginning, but this case specifically, does it work with him representing himself in the sense that he's like, I have been falsely accused not as a man, not as what I've done outside of the office, but as a district attorney in my official capacity. Do you think that's what adds this differently for him representing himself as opposed to him representing himself in a murder case or another criminal case?
Yes. If this were any other type of case, I think representing himself would have been a horrible mistake. And originally, I thought it was a mistake here, too. But as we see the way he's doing it and the questions that he's asking of this particular witness, he was in it. Nobody, even when you're represented by the best of attorneys, nobody knows better than you the day-to-day, the minute-by-minute. And he's bringing out these points, and he's doing it in a very calm demeanor that this woman here, this person that he trusted to be an employee, is really the one the jurors should look askance at, and not him. I think he's doing an effective job.
Well, we're waiting for day 6 in this trial to resume. We are keeping a very careful eye on the courtroom feed. As soon as it starts, we'll make sure to jump into it. We don't want you to miss anything. We're recapping important testimony in this case. We want you to be completely up to date, know where we are, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But before we continue on in the Wallace Bradsher case, we want to play you the top crime stories of the day here on Law and Crime. Thanks, Anthony. You can go to lawandcrime.com to look at more of the top legal stories of the day. But let's talk a little bit more about that TSA case. Back here with Jonna Spilbor. It's not about what the woman in the video who's her daughter was saying. What do you think she's going to do, set off a shoe bomb? By the way, I thought you're never supposed to say bomb in an airport.
Yeah, I know. She should have been next after saying that.
But if she says that, it's not really about the woman in the wheelchair, right? I don't think the TSA agents were thinking she's the threat. Isn't the idea that someone might have been using her as a vehicle to commit a crime?
Yeah, this isn't the first time that we've heard of elderly people in wheelchairs being patted down because listen, we live in an age now where terrorists have to get smarter because knock on wood, we're doing a pretty good job of keeping the airlines safe, and we want to continue to do that. And so I'm not understanding the outrage in this video because, as you can see, even though this was a lengthy search, she didn't hurt the woman. This wasn't combative. She was being very careful, and probably that's why.
But she's touching her in very intimate areas.
But that's what happens to anybody who's in this kind of secondary area getting patted down, whether you're in a wheelchair, whether you're in your 90s, or whether you're in your 30s and on your own 2 feet. Them's the rules. And so, is it inconvenient? Yes. Does anybody want to take their shoes off and on the filthy floor every time you're walking to get on a plane? No. But this is the age in which we live, and this is what we have to do to continue to stay safe.
Well, a lot of people say better safe than sorry, but here's the question. So everyday travelers, let's say they're in this position or they have a loved one who's in this position, what is crossing the line legally?
Legally, well, obviously they can't. They've got people watching this search because you don't want it to get, while you have to pat down areas that are sensitive, it can't cross the line and become basically assaultive or abusive. And I don't see any of that going on here. She's not putting her hands up any of the clothing or down any of the clothing of this particular person. She's got her gloves on. She's announcing what she's doing before she's doing it. I don't see any violation of the law here.
Do you think there was anything improper about her daughter videotaping this? I believe one of the agents might have stepped inside of the view so she could prevent this from being filmed. Is there anything actually illegal about doing that?
No, I don't see any problem with recording what's going on. See, I've had that done to me, Jesse, where she has to go around the woman's, and it's uncomfortable, but you can hide things there. I think the daughter was upset just because this is her mother. Nobody wants to see that happening. But she had a right to record it, and I really don't understand the nature of the viral video of this. One time I had, it pales in comparison. I was on an airline the airline gave me a full bottle of wine, unopened, full bottle of wine, which I thanked them for and tried it out when I left that airline. When I went back to return home, I still had that bottle with me. I hadn't consumed it. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I hadn't consumed it. Couldn't bring it back on the same airline that gave it to me. So I had to dispose of it, which I thought was unfair. That didn't go viral. But you know what I mean. The rules are the rules, and we have to play by them to stay safe.
It's a tricky situation. We're going to cover it more as soon as we have an update in that case, or I shouldn't even say a case, the situation. No legal action has been brought or anything like that, but we'll update you if anything should change. And we will go to lawandcrime.com to follow more of the top crime and legal stories of the day. Let's switch back to the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina. We are continuing to monitor the courtroom feed. As soon as it begins, we'll make sure to go there. We don't want you to miss anything in this trial. We've been playing the testimony of Cindy Blitzer, the main subject of this case, because Wallace Bradsher faces 6 felonies and a misdemeanor count in connection with allegedly operating an illegal scheme with another district attorney to hire his wife for a no-show job. In other words, Cindy Blitzer was getting paid. She got paid $48,000, but really didn't have any work to do. Collecting paychecks, that's taxpayer money. That's a real big no-no. That's a problem. So the question is, how much, if anything, did Wallace Bradsher know? Did he know about this? Did he really not only know about it, but continue to tell Cindy Blitzer to keep paying your keep collecting your paycheck, don't worry about it? If he really is the guilty party, that's what the jury has to decide. Cindy Blitzer took the stand last week. She had the ability, I should say, Mr. Bradsher had the ability to cross-examine her directly. I'm going to play you right now. This is when she talks about, we talked about a little bit earlier, when she's allegedly had employees from her husband's office take online nursing school classes for her. Now, she claims they were only assisting her. But again, using government funds for personal benefit doesn't look so good for her, but might look good for Bradsher. Let's play that right now.
As you just
That's Cindy Blitzer, testifying in the Wallace Bradsher case out of North Carolina, talking about whether or not she had her husband's employees doing online classes for her, taking or assisting her with online classes for nursing school. So why does this matter in the overall scheme about an attorney who's on trial for allegedly hiring her, paying her, but she had no work to do? Let's talk a little bit more about it right now with Jonna Spilbor. What do you think about this?
So the tables are turning yet again. Did you pick up that really salient point that I think Bradsher made, basically trying to get the jury to believe that, wait a minute, Cindy Blitzer was originally going to work for her own husband. At the same time, she had a plan to take nursing classes because eventually she wanted to be a nurse. And the way it should have panned out is that she was going to collect a paycheck from her husband while not working and simply taking online courses instead. But that got derailed when the powers that be said, hang on, we can't have wives working for husbands anymore. So that's when this scheme was hatched. And perhaps the scheme was really hatched by the Blitzer family, and Bradsher was almost like a pawn. I could see that is probably direction that Bradsher is trying to take this.
Well, here's what we have right now, if you're sitting in the jury. Craig Blitzer, we're going to play his testimony after our short break. He already took a plea deal, pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge, has yet to be sentenced in connection with this whole scheme. Cindy Blitzer admitted herself that what she knew she was doing was wrong, collecting paychecks, not doing work. She admitted wrongdoing. Wallace Bradsher's the defendant. He hasn't been convicted of anything yet. So when you sit there, Jonna, and the jury's thinking about that, and these are the facts, how are they to believe, or what evidence is there so far that Wallace Bradsher knew or operated this scheme? I mean, we're taking the testimony of 2 key witnesses here.
Right.
Why not believe them?
Well, why not believe them? Because they have a whole lot at stake. They've already pled guilty. And there's a reason for that. And the reason why they've pled guilty and are testifying against this particular defendant is because there's a promise to be lenient with them. Not that the jury knows about the promise, but there's a reason for that.
Isn't there like a prayer for on judgment or something? Like the idea is he's still going to testify truthfully, right?
Well, the whole idea is that you're supposed to testify truthfully, and if successful, that Blitzer's conviction ceases to exist. It's never going to go on the books. It's like he's pleading, but he's not convicted, and then they'll just wipe the slate.
You mean that's
clean.
what he's hoping for?
That's what he's hoping for. That's what that prayer for judgment means in North Carolina. So that's why he's doing. He has incentive to make sure that there's a conviction against Bradsher. But Bradsher continues to make points in this case because he is just slowly and methodically basically saying, I didn't know. You two had this plan. You're the one who wanted to be the nurse. Your husband was supposed to be in on it with you. And now here I am having to defend myself in a court of law.
It's an interesting case, definitely an interesting case. We're going to cover it more as soon as we have the live feed. We'll take a short break. We'll be back in a minute. One of the interesting aspects of this case is that you continually hear witnesses saying, well, I got the okay from someone else. I got the okay. But is that okay? Let's talk a little bit more about it with Jonna Spilbor. So this guy, Craig Blitzer, he said he got the okay to hire his own wife because he saw that Wallace Bradsher was hiring his wife.
Right.
Later on, he's going to talk about how an attorney that he was representing him said it was okay, or maybe it was okay, or that Wallace Bradsher said it was okay for him to have Cindy be working in Wallace Bradsher's office and getting paid, and there's nothing wrong with that, and her not doing. And then you hear Cindy saying, well, I got the okay from Wallace Bradsher, and I got the okay from my husband to keep doing what I was doing. What does the law say about that, about getting the okay from other people?
So this is really interesting because it does appear that, I'm calling it a scheme for right now. Originally, there was no scheme in that one DA wanted to employ his wife and the other DA wanted to employ his wife. And you could see that somewhere down the road, you know, the people in power said, there's an appearance of impropriety here. We're no longer going to let people in those positions hire their spouses. So now you've got two high-powered prosecutors who have to say to themselves, well, wait a minute. My wife has a skill set from working in this office. His wife has a skill set, similar skill set from working in that office. We'll just have them work in our respective offices, and that'll be a loophole that they can kind of dive through and nobody's violating any law. And actually, if you stopped it right there, that's probably okay. We wouldn't be having a trial right now. The issue arose when it was claimed that Cindy Blitzer was really not working. She was showing up. She was a warm body. She was clocking in and out. She was getting a paycheck, but there was no work for her to do. That's where the rub is in this entire case. That is where the rub is. So I think the issue is going to turn on whether or not the defendant was part of a scheme to pay Cindy Blitzer, knowing full well that he was not going to give her any work. And he's already, the defendant has already, dispelled a big piece of that by saying, well, when I happened upon you, when I saw you in action, you were actually in action, working. So I wasn't part of this scheme, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Well, let's listen to what Craig Blitzer had to say about his conversations with the defendant, because they are co-conspirators. That's what it's being alleged right now. And their conversations are probably the most critical piece of evidence in this entire case, even though it really is he said versus he said. But let's play some of his testimony right now. That's Craig Blitzer, the alleged co-conspirator in the Wallace Bradsher case. It's alleged that Wallace Bradsher operated a scheme with Craig Blitzer. They came up with it at allegedly a pizza parlor to hire one another, to hire each other's wives. But Wallace Bradsher is alleged to have hired Cindy Blitzer, paid her for work she didn't really do, and that is technically stealing taxpayer money. So let's talk a little bit more about one crucial point here that I think is the elephant in the room here.
Right.
Who's the guilty party? Because we have Cindy Blitzer, who went on the stand and said she knew what she was doing was wrong by not having work, collecting paychecks and cashing them. You have Craig Blitzer, who seems to be her defender, who's actually pled a misdemeanor charge, pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge, and he will be sentenced. And then you have Wallace Bradsher, her boss, who said he didn't know anything was going on. Who is the guilty party?
I think we're looking at her on screen.
You think it's Cindy?
Right now. She comes across as very innocent, but actually, you know, she's very nicely telling the jury how she knew darn well she was taking a paycheck that she didn't earn. And now they're throwing, both she and her husband, co-defendants, are throwing this defendant squarely under the bus to save themselves.
Her demeanor when she testified seemed a little bit aloof. She seemed a little bit taken aback by certain questions. But do you think that's a ruse? Maybe this woman really knows what's going on more than she was letting on?
Well, what she knows, what Cindy Blitzer knows, is that her testimony needs to help get a conviction against the defendant, Mr. Bradsher, in this case. And so she's been working for a DA's office for quite a while. I'm sure she knows how to make that happen, or at least in her mind she does. The more I think about this case, Jesse, I mean, look at it from, take it out of the DA's office for a minute. Take taxpayer money out of it for a minute. So I have 10 employees, and every month they tell me what they do on a client's invoice, right? I get to look and see what they do if I'm not personally observing. But let's suppose one of my employees was making that all up. You know, I did this on Wednesday, I did this on Thursday, I did this on Friday. And that's how I'm overseeing it. Who is at fault here if it comes to pass that that employee, i.e. in this case Cindy Blitzer, wasn't doing the things that I expected or that they said they were doing? Is that on me or is that on the employee?
There's a whole discussion about who her direct supervisor was. She says her ultimate authority was Mr. Bradsher, but he's not approving her timesheets. Here's the way that I look at it. If you're working at a law firm, it's billable hours. You go through the actual list of hours worked and how much time you spend on a matter. I don't know how it works in a district attorney's office. Is it different? How does it actually work? We hear this thing called about beacon time, but we don't know what beacon time really is. How does it work? Do you know?
Well, I mean, it works very similar to the structure of a private law firm in that you have a human resource person, I mean, because they have to get, they've got vacation pay, sick pay, they've got retirement monies that got to go someplace. So you have typically you have a human resource department who is supposed to be the general overseer of that. But you also have an immediate supervisor. In most DA's offices, you have what we call bureaus, right? So you have a group of attorneys that are working on like cases, and they have a supervisor, and then above that, bureau chief is the head honcho. So there is a ladder. And so you have actually more than one person who could be supervising a particular person. And however Cindy Blitzer was getting away with it, she was doing a pretty good job.
That's my question. If this is true, this is stealing taxpayer money. This is a huge issue. How on earth, if this was actually a scheme concocted by the two of them, and she was, really the conduit to do it all, so the three of them, let's just say, let's say they were all guilty, they thought no one was going to notice this?
Well, let's go back to Cindy Blitzer's testimony, because this was a little confusing to me, but this might make more sense. Remember when the defendant said, when I found you at the courthouse, basically, which is where her office was, you had the so-and-so file out in front of you and I needed it. Maybe Cindy Blitzer didn't work in a giant, it wasn't like a scene from The Office where everybody had cubicles and you could see everyone. Maybe she had this little office inside the office at the courthouse, and she didn't have eyeballs on her. That's very possible. It could have been that way, and that's how she was able to get away with this for as long as she did.
Well, let's learn a little bit more about it from Craig Blitzer, the co-conspirator in this entire bizarre scheme about two district attorneys who are alleged. They both resigned, by the way, and Mr. Blitzer is waiting for his sentence after pleading guilty to a misdemeanor in connection with this criminal scheme. But let's learn a little bit more about how this all went down, his communications with the defendant. It's really interesting to hear because, again, we're going to play it for you in a little bit, when the defendant, Mr. Bradsher, had the opportunity to cross-examine his co-conspirator. Let's play you some more of his direct examination, though, and understand how this whole scheme happened. Okay, that's Craig Blitzer, the co-conspirator in this weird, bizarre scam, or alleged scam, I should say, whereby Wallace Bradsher, the defendant, is alleged to have agreed with Craig Blitzer to hire one another's wives for no-show jobs. And Cindy Blitzer, who is the wife of Craig Blitzer, was hired by Wallace Bradsher, worked in that office. By her account, she was working for a period of time when all of a sudden the main file she was working on, the Shockley case, was taken away from her by Wallace Bradsher, allegedly. And she kept complaining she had no work to do, but nobody responded. Nobody did anything. And she kept collecting those paychecks and cashing them. Well, who pays her? Taxpayers. And that is the problem. So, Jonna, here's something that I'm a little confused about. The reason this case is a little different than anything else is, if you have a situation where somebody says, I was getting paid and I didn't have any work to do, or I was getting paid for projects that I didn't work on, and you want to blame your boss, how is he supposed to monitor, right, what you're working on or not? What they're trying to get him on is that he not only knew about it, but that he tried to cover it up. That's the sexy part about this case, right?
That's the sexy part, but I also think it's the part that is going to get lost among the other sexy parts. For example, you raised a point earlier this morning, and you basically said, what did Bradsher have to gain from this whole plot?
Right, because he's not getting any money.
Right, which is a great question. And now, so fast forward to, we were just watching, is it Craig Blitzer?
Yes.
Blitzer's testimony. He just laid out for this jury what the motive is on behalf of the Blitzers to hatch this plan. He said, look, I went from private practice to becoming a DA. I was taking a huge pay cut. We needed the money. My wife needed to work. Bam! Done. That is the reason this plan was hatched. And then if you recall earlier, that same witness said, I'm the one who called Mr. Bradsher because I said, well, if your wife is working for you, how come my wife can't work for me? Boom, done. I think he didn't mean to shoot himself in the foot with that testimony, but he kind of did.
Cindy Blitzer said it herself. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but we needed the income. We needed the cash. I get all that. What does Mr. Bradsher, the defendant, have to gain? Now, you talked about it earlier about quid pro quo, right? Is that enough for him to risk his entire life for the fact that he owes something to Craig Blitzer? Because let's break it down. We're not talking about his wife collecting a paycheck for work she didn't do. We're talking about another person's wife. And according to the Blitzers, who are now both testifying against Bradsher, he tried to cover it up, and he said it's okay. Allow your wife, Craig, to keep collecting these paychecks, keep cashing them. Don't worry about work. We'll put her on special projects, even though there were no special projects. And he's fighting this, Bradsher, saying, if this was true, why didn't you say something was weird about it? You know, again, what does the defendant have to gain? He's going to risk his entire life. He faces up to 18 years in prison for these crimes. What does he have to gain?
And that's probably why we're in trial. So my only, and this is speculation at this point, I think his only incentive would have been if it were a quid pro quo situation and his wife was going to remain employed, but rightfully so, like working and getting a paycheck for it. Thus far, there's no evidence that there was quid pro quo. Thus far, there is only evidence that you have the Blitzer family concerned about finances, mad that Mrs. Blitzer couldn't work for Mr. Blitzer, calling up another seasoned prosecutor who did have his wife working for him and trying to figure out a loophole that they could make this scheme work. And so far, Jesse, you're making an excellent point. Like, Bradsher should have hired you because you're making this point great. Like, he had nothing to gain by this. Therefore, why would he be a part of it? And ergo, the jury should be led to believe he wasn't.
Bradsher faces felony obtaining property by false pretense, aiding and abetting, conspiracy, 3 counts of obstruction of justice, as well as a misdemeanor for failure to discharge the duties of his office. This carries with it significant prison time. The rest of his life basically could be spent in a prison. 18 years is a very long time.
As it is, his career could be over because the bar is going to come down on him if they haven't already and say, you're not going to be able to practice law anymore. Let
me ask you that for Blitzer. So he has yet to be sentenced in connection with this crime, but he will probably lose his law license, right? If that becomes the case, what does he do for the rest of his life?
I doubt he's going to lose his law license. If this goes down the way it's supposed to, with basically a non-conviction, he will still be able to practice law.
Really?
Yes, in his state. You can commit, I hate to say this, as an attorney, you can commit certain misdemeanors and still maintain your license to practice law. Felonies, you're automatically out. That makes total sense. But certain misdemeanors, you're allowed to keep your license too, which I don't know if I agree with that, but that is the state of the affairs.
I always like to think they think lawyers are perfect people and that we shouldn't get in trouble. We're held to a higher standard. But speaking of higher standards, let's learn a little bit more about the standards by which Craig Blitzer and Wallace Bradsher allegedly operated. We are learning more from this co-conspirator, who was almost a co-defendant in this case, about how this all took place. We're going to play you some more of Craig Blitzer's testimony, and again, as soon as we see a live feed in that courtroom, we'll make sure to go to it. But again, this is Craig Blitzer. Okay, so this is a little bit of a complicated case, but we're trying to break it down right now. So that man right there is Craig Blitzer. It's alleged that he and the defendant, Wallace Bradsher, entered into a scheme where they would hire one another's wives, because it was illegal to employ your own wife when you're the district attorney in your own office, to hire each other's wives, and that would be okay. That's legal. The problem for Mr. Bradsher and the defendant, as well as Craig Blitzer, is that it's alleged that he hired Cindy Blitzer, his wife, for a no-show job, getting paid for not doing anything. Now, here's the question. I want to bring back in law and crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. There was an interesting back and forth last week from the State Bureau of Investigation, or SBI agent, David Whitley, the person who was one of the lead investigators in this case and unraveled this whole situation. Wallace Bradsher accused him of lying, that he said they had, when he was investigating this, he obviously interviewed Mr. Bradsher, the defendant. He said that Bradsher led him on a wild goose chase of different theories. He said, oh, I got the okay from here, here, here. Bradsher accused an SBI agent of lying. That is a very serious claim, especially when you are in trial for, 3 counts of obstruction of justice. I mean, that's a big claim. Do you think that was wise to make that move?
Well, when your own butt is on the line, you are going to pull out all the stops in defense of yourself. And listen, I've been doing this for 25 years. There have been times I've had officers on the stand who I did not believe were being truthful. It's just that I wasn't representing myself at the time. And look, no matter how you slice it, so far, this case is complicated and convoluted. In fact, that's what the SBI agent said. This was a convoluted case. When you take those convoluted facts and you try to put them in front of a jury, you need to sort of untangle them. And I think what happened here is that Bradsher's position is, I didn't know anything was amiss until this investigation started happening. And then when I looked into it, oh my, there were things happening under my nose that I was not aware of, and it's not my fault. The issue is going to be, how much did Bradsher know, Jesse? How much did he know about this scheme?
What do you make of these allegations? So SBI agent Whitley said on the stand last week that Bradsher sent him on a wild goose chase that just made the investigation even longer, prolonged it. He said Bradsher told him he had permission from the North Carolina Administrative Office of the Courts and the North Carolina State Bar to allow Cindy Blitzer, to work in a shared employee program. He said that she was working on special projects. Whitley asked for a list of these special projects. Bradsher never supplied these special projects. I've always been the one to say, if one person says something about you, maybe it's not true. But if an SBI agent and Cindy Blitzer and Craig Blitzer and other people in the office are saying something was going wrong and Mr. Bradsher might have been up to wrongdoing,
Well,
what do you think?
Hang on. SBI has access to subpoena power. And if Wallace Bradford said that Bradsher said that the Office of Court Administration, or the equivalent there in North Carolina, was giving him permission to do something, all SBI had to do, issue a subpoena. Get those records, right? You don't have to rely on, in fact, as a matter of fact, since this person is a defendant who is not compelled to testify against himself, he didn't have to supply anything. Get the records someplace else. Do your job as an investigator. He was a defendant. I do not have to give you the goods to prosecute me. Thank you, Fifth Amendment. So I think that was a little unfair for the SBI agent to say that this defendant sent him on a wild goose chase.
And final question for you, Jonna, talking about this SBI agent. He said, if I lied about something, it's illegal. A mistake is not. Talking about the fact that he might have, Bradsher accused him of conflating his notes and saying that things that he told him in his interview were not true. When an SBI agent comes there and gives off the idea that maybe he's infallible and maybe made a mistake, what does the jury take of that?
If you make an honest mistake, I think that humanizes anybody. SBI agent, defendant, attorney, judge, with the jury. But you also got to remember one thing. When you have a law enforcement officer on the stand who investigates any crime, while their job is to get to the truth, oftentimes what they do, Jesse, is they have their theory, and the stuff that doesn't work goes away, and the stuff that does is what you're left with. Sometimes the stuff that doesn't work works very well for the defendant because it can absolve them or exonerate them of any wrongdoing, and it's called Brady material, and you can't get rid of that. So maybe that's where this defendant was going with that. It happens, and he was maybe perhaps a good cross-examiner on this.
Well, as always, we'll have to wait and see. Law and crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to cover cases where there are no dead bodies, and this one, I think, is more complex than some of those cases, so stay tuned, you guys.
I mean, you're dealing with greed, corruption, taxpayer money.
Yes.
It's a big deal. It's a very big deal where elected officials are accused of wrongdoing. So, Jonna, thank you. We are going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.